Hello, welcome back. I wanted to do an interesting take on necromancy and kind of expand upon necromancy as a legitimate business, opposed to it being a taboo, which is typically seen in many settings in fantasy. And for inspiration, I'm going to steal from Prohibition era during the United States, as well as I've been playing a lot of Dark Tide, so a lot of the Underhive kind of grim darkness is kind of seeping into the idea. And I think it would work well more in a kind of a city kind of setting. You could do it across a nation if you have like a centralized sort of like government or something where maybe guilds are allowed to work throughout a region. I think this idea could fit well into that. But ideally, or kind of the way I envision it, is almost like in a mega city with like, like an aristocratic hierarchy of mages. And there's these kind of not very liked, necromancers or this very powerful guild who have, like, a seat on the council, but many of the other crafts kind of look down on them, but they're kind of a necessity of society nowadays. So I wanna start with how they would have been used back in the day before they were, allowed or legalized. So if you wanted to steal that and just use that, you could. So, I mean, obviously, in the real world, right? Seances, kind of the occult, has always been a thing. People have been very desperate to talk to their loved ones that have passed. It's been a business for a long time. Psychics and the things preying upon people's grief to profit. I think that would, work really well in D&D because instead of it just being fake, you literally could use speak with dead. You literally could seance or summon the spirit of the person and talk to them. Now, speak with dead, the spell typically is used on a corpse and makes the corpse reanimate enough to talk to you. But obviously, you can have a bit of fun with necromancy. You don't have to just do rules as written. But even if you were just doing, the head, talk to it, that could lead to some really gruesome kind of scenes, or maybe like you find maybe a widow that's like digging up her husband's grave that was killed in battle or something because she wanted to talk to him one last time. You could have these like really kind of like horrific, grim, dark kind of situations if you wanted to go that way with it. Of course, if you wanted to keep it a little lighter, you could just steal from seances in the real world. The candles, the holding the hands, the floating table, the crystal balls, things of that nature. You could steal from that and use that instead if you wanted to keep it way more PG and not get into the really gruesome stuff. But outside of just people that need the closure, what other uses can necromancy have? Well, detective work. If someone's murdered on the street and you can just bring in the local necromancer to be like, "Hey, yo, who killed you?" And again, the person has to be willing. So if it's a member of organized crime and, they got killed by a member of their own gang, they may be less willing to give out details. So you can't always trust the witness, right? You would kind of treat them as a witness account, but you could get a lot of useful information from them. And then that would create like a whole like black market trade of like weapons and things that would steal souls so that if you're killing someone and you want to make sure like you're a real professional, you want to make sure, absolutely sure that the person can't talk. That would be, you know, you can kind of see the secondary effects of that being a thing where if detectives are allowed to use necromantic magic to speak with the dead to find out what happened to people, how that might kind of change crime. And maybe in the beginning, that's super frowned upon. Necromantic magic is super frowned upon. But then there's situations where even though it's illegal, right? Even though it's kind of frowned upon, I mean, people did this in the real world, right? People went to the psychics to get information about legal cases, murders and such back in the day. And then they would use the information from the psychic, hopefully, to get them more concrete evidence that they could use in the trial. So you could kind of have it start off that way if you don't want to go the full legal, or maybe it's like, yeah, necromancy is frowned upon. It's technically illegal, but like, the guard's a little corrupt. They have a few necromancers on their payroll. So if you really need help, there's this guy downtown. The police won't do anything about him because he agrees to help out the police to let him practice. You can kind of have that kind of situation going on. Then if you want to get even darker with it, you could kinda steal from the idea of protection money, that kind of racketeering and the idea of, like, reverse mortgages and things where, you get money so that now, like, while you're alive, but then they get to take your house when you're dead, but you could do that with, like, the bodies, like, where, people that are really poor, really hard up on cash will, like, literally sell their bodies to the necromancers, like the necromancer gang or guild, and it'll be a situation where it's like, "Hey, we will give you money now while you're alive, but when you die, we own your body to use as we see fit." And you can have that kind of be a thing that occurs. If you agree to one of these circumstances, the necromancy guild will, yeah, they'll show up and they will give you money every like month or whatever. But if you if you try to skip town on them, if you try to disappear, they're going to be looking out for you. And it's kind of a situation where like, yeah, it's really helpful and you could get some extra money, but what are they gonna do with you afterwards? And then you could have the whole thing of what are these people being used for? And the way I would use them is if it was legal in this world, I would look at caste systems that have existed in the real world and look at the type of work that they've done. There are quite a different societies that have had a sort of caste-based system or class-based system, and you can steal things from them. And if you really want to get into it, you could talk about the dynamics of like, hey, if these groups of people, right, the undesirables, used to do this work and now we have the undead doing this work, what happens to them? You can kind of get into that whole rabbit hole. You could, if you really wanted to make the necromancy guild be like a crime boss family, I think it leans really easy into it because it could be like a situation where they're peddling drugs, right? They're peddling drugs to get people hooked so they constantly have to pay. And the people, need the fix. So they go to the necromancy guild to do the whatever you want to call it. Death insurance, maybe? Death insurance might be a good one, where they'll pay you, so that way they'll pay you the money that you can go pay to get your drugs. You don't know this, but they're actually the ones making the drugs. So you're really just giving their money back to them, and then you agree legally to work for them upon death. And then when you die, they contract you out and they make more money, and that's kind of how they came into prominence. If you want this to be like a situation of, hey, these people are so influential that they're like a part of government, it gets to the point where if the undead family was to disappear, right, and all the work that's being done, kind of, the really undesirable jobs, maybe they're the ones cleaning out the sewer systems, the really like gross things that the average person would want to do, they handle. And if they were to disappear, if like all the undead that they were supplying stopped working, how that could like really cripple the system. You kind of think that through as well. I would also just to try and make it, like, seem a little bit more legitimate, avoid certain words, like, any word that would be typically associated with necromancy, I would maybe try to avoid, like, uh, you know, come up with, like, a cool name for things, like, I imagine that they wouldn't call zombies zombies, but they would have, like, some fancy old-timey term for it, like, maybe, like, varlet. I've been playing a lot of Dark Tide, and one of the tech priests calls you varlets, which is, like, an old-timey word for, like, a boy servant. Look up like old timey words for servants or slaves and kind of like that kind of stuff and use those words instead of like zombie or, something like that because I think it, has a different mental image. Maybe you could use like cadaver. Like instead of it being like death, you could be like, "Oh yeah, we have a cadaver insurance, so we pay you now and then once you are no longer are using your body, your soul's left it, well, we use your cadaver for other means and to help, the society, to help keep the city running. You'd be an asset." Like think of the sales pitch of it that way because they're trying to sell people on this idea of what you're doing is almost noble, really, like almost like you're selling your body to science, right? Like you choosing to give this husks that you're not even using anymore to us so that we can help keep the city running while your soul goes on to whatever afterlife you prescribe to. If you really think about it, it's almost selfish just to bury your body or just to burn your body or whatever religious rites for death that you have in your setting. Giving you to us is really the generous thing to do, the humane thing to do, because then just think about all the help and the good we could do with you once you're done using your body. Now, something else you can do, I think 5th edition's really kinda moved away from this. I don't know if this was even a thing in 3.5 or if I'm misremembering this, but I'm pretty sure all healing magic used to be necromancy. I just checked, and necromancy is still used for things like revivify or any other sort of resurrection spell, but things like cure wounds and such have been changed to evocation. But if you wanted to do it, like literally they control all aspects of necromancy, then yes, like revivify healing services would also be considered part of it. I know necromancy is typically associated with undead, but the living and healing can also be an aspect of it. So if you want to go less into like the whole like crime family thing, or if you do kind of want to use like the shady uh, medical system, especially in like the United States or other countries that don't have a very good system, you can kind of use that as inspiration, where maybe you know to pay for your dead one's medical expenses, they'll give you the option to, sell the body to the hospital to kinda, like, clear the debts, and you can get into kind of that awful things where they'll intentionally, like, overcharge you for, like, a level 1 cure wounds, and then you have to ask for the itemized bill, and you can get into all that awful shenanigans if you want to. Them, refusing to give people what they actually need, and instead maybe just like slapping a cure wounds on it, doing the bare minimum, and then sending them on their way with little help. I don't know. You could take a lot of different inspiration and go a lot of different ways. I really like the idea of necromancy not just being undeath, but including any sort of life force magic, which would include anything that heals people. So I would personally, maybe add that together, make it be like, okay, the necromancy guild controls all the hospitals. They, they have their whole insurance thing we discussed earlier. Maybe, they're creating the medicines used in the hospital, but they're also getting people hooked on them like painkillers, like opioids, or they have harder stuff that they're getting people on as well. And much like the pharmaceutical companies do, they try to get you hooked on things that are very addictive that you don't necessarily need, or there are less addictive alternatives available that maybe like the local druids might give you, but then they're always trying to discredit the local druids and stuff. The druids and stuff might be able to give you like over the counter stuff or the alchemists, but they're really the main ones. You would have to have some sort of maybe friend or insight to kind of get the more natural stuff. Eventually, they would make so much money that they could just kind of buy out the other people or just absorb them. It depends on how far along you want this to have gone. If you want this to be like this giant mega corporation that's like really kind of evil, you can really send it all the way through. It's already merged with a bunch of people, bought out all the competition, has a sole ownership of most of the healing available to the public, except for like what they themselves can do and their friends and family can do. I guess it depends on how developed you want this faction to be. Or you could have it where it's still like really early on, they just became legal. They are only doing maybe resurrection services because the other churches or the druids or, the alchemist or whatever handle the other kind of healing stuff. And they can just do what they can do in fifth edition. So they only handle like resurrections based things, and they only handle cadaver insurance, contracting varlets for work. And they if they you just give them those three domains, which is all they have access to according to the D&D 5th edition spellbook. I think that's still enough of a empire to kind of start with and to grow with. I do think the drug thing could be a really nice way if you wanted to make them a little bit shadier. Like if you just do the three, you could have them be like a legitimate service and kind of a big help to the town. And yes, their services for cheap labor has made life a lot harder for the lower class citizens of that society, and you could kind of play out the unrest of that. Or if you want to make them like super evil, like I said, you can make them be drug lords, more of a mob family kind of style, where they're getting these low class citizens hooked on these drugs, or they're using them. They're basically finding some means to control them to increase the likelihood that they'll stay in poverty because the more poverty they're in, the more likely they are to need to sign up for the cadaver insurance, so they have more fresh bodies always coming in. Maybe you make them like a landlord or land barons and they buy up all the cheap housing and they make the slums, they own the slums, they're paying rent to them, they increase the rent so that the people can never quite have enough money without needing to use their services. You can kind of explore all that. You can really take a lot of inspiration from the real world, twist it slightly. It'll be something that the players will immediately resonate with, right? So if you do any of this, they'll be like, "Hey, I hate this about the real world," right? So they will immediately see them as the bad guy, and then you can kind of play that out. If you want to have a lot of real world implications, you could do things like, you know, the guy who made insulin sold it for $1 to a university, yet there's a company that produces it and you can't get it for $1 in the US. You can kind of play on things like that where they bought out the Druids Guild or they bought out the Alchemist Guild, and now health potions are like 20 times the price they used to be because they're owned by these awful people now, and you can kind of play all that out if you want to. Again, it depends on how far you want to go. This is just an interesting idea, I thought, of a different take on the typical like necromancers that are walking around and stealing bodies and like making zombies to, like, I don't know, like enact vengeance against the living or something like that. I think this is a different take on it and how it could integrate with a pre-existing society without it being, I think, too much. You can dial this up, you can dial this down, you can have it where they just kind of handle the minutia that you don't really wanna get into, and it could be an interesting dynamic as maybe, if you're part of your foreigners to the city, and it's like this big mage city with all these different guilds, and then they learn about the services, and obviously, like, learning about the fact that you can choose to get paid, like, make it like a really low sum of money, like a sum of money that you'd be like, "Oh, well, that's not really worth it," but these people are like, have to because it's the only way they can pay their rent and get food, and they, like, basically are giving up their bodies to be turned into undead. If you wanna be really evil with it, you could lure it that, like, if you are undead, your soul gets tethered to the body, and that's what animates it, so they don't get to go to the afterlife. It really depends on how evil you want to make this or how, above board, kinda shady, but technically not illegal, not super, like, awful, you wanna make it. Yeah, I guess that was enough of me rambling about the necromancy school and how to take it in a different way. I have some other ideas for the necromancy school that I think I've seen other people do in the past. Probably aren't new to all of you, but I might continue this in another video. Thank you for watching. If you have any ideas of how to build upon this, maybe some historical examples that you would like to interject into this idea, leave in the comments below. Would love to see it. Maybe you might inspire somebody. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. Help me out a bunch. And thank you for watching.